Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today it is a video where once again, effectively the media and a lot of people are catching up with what reform is really all about. Because you're seeing a few articles and commentators saying things like this: reform is now a left-wing party. Now, I know what many of you might be thinking, hang on, I've always been told Reform is this far-right party, what's going on? The whole reason Nigel Farage even got into politics in the first place was because he was completely and utterly inspired by Margaret Thatcher. Again, another person who is known as being incredibly right-wing. Well, we're going to go through all this, because just to throw this out there early, yeah, this is the media playing catch-up, and no, Reform is not a left-wing party. They are, however, doing this thing called triangulation, where they know they're not really going to lose their right-wing voters, and will therefore effectively flank parties like Labour from the left to try and entice the people who vote Labour who are on the fence about Reform to come over to Reform. Because ultimately, Reform have never been about completely removing and cutting the benefit system as it stands. They do understand the idea of a safety net. However, the funniest thing about the benefits they are looking to, well, effectively expand is that they're not actually very popular, but we'll get into all that. So Nigel Farage's party is only right-wing if you define your political spectrum entirely in terms of attitudes to national borders and on woke issues such as CRT and trans rights, or if you see climate change and net zero as left-right issues. Well, I do. If your political spectrum is drawn along economic lines, on the other hand, Reform is now firmly on the centre-left. I don't actually agree with this, by the way. However, in some policy areas, they are certainly flanking Labour to the left. Again, this is to try and get the type of Labour voter who wants all foreign criminals deported and wants illegal immigrants deported, but thinks that Reform are effectively loony Thatcherites. To make it absolutely clear to everyone, I am absolutely the type of person that thinks we need neo-Thatcherism. However, I think this analysis is taking the last week of politics into account too much and ignoring the rest of what Reform are actually going to do if their contract is to be based off anything, which I will say, from what I hear of Farage's opinion on the contract, obviously he stood by it, but from what I hear after the election, he actually ripped it up and effectively said, we need more detail and it needs to be rewritten. You know, effectively, it's not good enough. However, he is talking specifically about detail rather than the overall direction of the party, but we'll go into that later. So it's a party that advocates big spending which almost certainly wouldn't be balanced by the £50 billion it claims it could save by abolishing quangos and the like. Well, we'll have to get into the details of that. Reform is being sucked into a vacuum left behind by Labour's steady migration towards social liberalism and metropolitan centres. The territory of old Labour is a very natural place for it to reside. It was never going to form a government simply by picking off votes from the Tory voters, aggrieved by their own party's drift into social liberalism and the multiple failures of the last government across a range of issues. Boris Johnson showed how you can win an election by conquering the Red Wall. That has become Britain's principal electoral battleground, and Farage's party is far more convincing occupier of that ground than the Conservatives. Absolutely correct. And your average Red Wall voter, by the way, that is the type of person who, this may sound crude, but effectively they're the type of person that want to hang all the nonces and fund the NHS, which is just a crude way of saying they are largely economically left-wing and largely socially conservative. Obviously, I'm economically right-wing, however, I also understand that there's absolutely no point trying to win an election on that basis, unfortunately. We've had the hand on the stove of immigration and social liberalism, or progressivism I prefer to call it, for quite some time. That clearly that battleground is won. However, when it comes to economics, unfortunately everyone still thinks we actually live in a right-wing country and that the left-wing didn't have exactly what they asked for through the Tories because their rhetoric wasn't good enough for them. That's literally it, I'm not even joking. And because of this, the result is, well, what Reform have been doing the past week. So this article effectively goes into saying that the Tories actually have a bit of an open goal here, since Reform seem to have a bit of a leftward drift, as they are promising less in the way of tax cuts, because frankly it's not going to be affordable for what they want to do. And obviously if you have, I absolutely hate the term, unfunded tax cuts, or at the very least tax cuts that are going to lead to more borrowing, you're going to end up in Liz Truss territory, and Reform obviously know they can't get away with promising things like that. which makes sense. And so the Tories have a opportunity to put forward effectively a free market programme with lower spending, taxes and a smaller government. Again though, if the reform contract is to be believed, and okay, they can't lower taxes as much as they want to, they are certainly still in the realm of lowering spending, or if they're not lowering spending by that much, certainly readdressing where the money goes. In other words, not wasting as much, not putting as much into foreign aid, not spending billions upon billions on things like migrant hotels and the like. And, well, Andrew Neil kind of says this stuff best.
Is right is not what we think of as right on every issue. They are broadly right on social issues. They are broadly social conservatives. They're anti-woke stuff and all the rest of it. But on economic policy, they're actually left on so many issues, and sometimes to the left of Labour.
Yeah, pretty much. We're seeing this all over the place. Le Pen is obviously the biggest example of it. Even Trump, you had the Trump books over the COVID era. Hell, the whole tariff thing, as stupid as it was, very much an anti-free market, and ergo by that definition, left-wing policy. And I'm not being funny, but the estimates of these savings, I think the total comes to less than £5 billion, which even Rory Stewart's interview with Rachel Reeves, I mean, that's effectively a government rounding error. But to a lot of people, these seems like big promises and big cuts. They're not particularly. These are effectively chump change, and the whole point of reform reinstating the winter fuel allowance, which, listen, I'm going to level with you, I'm not in favour of that. And removing the two-child benefit cap, which, if reform implements all their other policies, I don't have much of an issue with, to be quite honest with you, because one, it's quite pro-natal, which I'm not as pro-natalist as a lot of other people. However, I am a bit of a encourage the family enjoyer. But also you can have welfare chauvinism for that. This is a benefit only for British nationals, etc., etc., which, by the way, Reform have indicated they will do with their social housing policy, so there's no reason to think they won't do it with other benefit policies. Which, again, I've been saying for quite a while, but I think people actually wouldn't really mind the winter fuel allowance thing if it wasn't clear that, well, Labour were paying out of the nose for migrants, illegal immigrants, refugees, basically everyone that isn't British. I don't think people would mind if we weren't giving 100 million a year to Mauritius, for example, to give away our own land. But that is what's happening, and that is what Reform are obviously trying to get on top of, as of course Andrew Neil is explaining.
And that's the card Farage is paying. He knows he won't have to institute a winter fuel allowance. Even going for the getting rid of the two-child cap benefit, which isn't popular among Reform supporters itself. Reform supporters aren't that keen on it. He's staking out ground on the left to capture Labour voters. He gets Conservative voters on the woke stuff. He gets potential Labour voters coming to him on welfare and big government spending.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Listen, I have accepted quite a while ago that I am not getting my neo-Thatcherism anytime soon. But even that actually comes into question, because Margaret Thatcher's first term wasn't actually the Thatcherism we think of today. Because the first thing they had to do was, well, stop hyperinflation effectively, which we are definitely going to have to do, because quantitative easing is effectively hiding inflation. It didn't do a very good job of hiding it over the course of COVID. However, we are still effectively living on an economy that's, well, largely based on debt and just fake. So back in 1979, Thatcher, in an attempt to slow the growth of the money supply and stop inflation, was to increase interest rates. And not only that, she also had to tax, because as stupid as MMT is, it is correct that taxation actually does slow inflation. And so VAT was increased to 15%. It's 20% now, by the way. I believe that was from about 10%. With a short-term rise in inflation, obviously because prices go up, but a long-term reduction in it due to the tax intake. The fiscal and monetary squeeze, combined with the North Sea oil effect, appreciated a real exchange rate. These moves hit businesses, especially manufacturing, as unemployment exceeded 2 million in the autumn of 1980. Political commentators hark back that she should obviously U-turn, and that's where she replied saying this lady is not for turning. And despite economists saying, oh, this is all terrible and not going to work, she kept through with it, inflation was brought under control, and then you ended up being able to implement what we know as Thatcherism today, from her second term onwards. Now, a Reform doing a similar thing here by reinstating some of the welfare? No, that's not my point here. What I'm pointing to here is the fact that Reform are the only party who even mention quantitative easing in their contract, or manifesto if you will. The Bank of England must stop paying interest to commercial banks on quantitative easing reserves. This approach would save around £35 billion a year and has been endorsed by senior figures at the Financial Times, New Economics Foundation, blah 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 blah, as well as 2 former deputy governors of the Bank of England. Now, quantitative easing is a massive issue for reasons that are quite hard to explain in this particular video. I've explained it in others, and you can find other resources online to explain it. Effectively, it's money printing with extra steps, and it's why we have a lot of fake economic growth effectively, and why we're not able to have a boom and effectively keep having a slow motion bust. Now, dealing with that is part of what Reform are banking on to massively increase economic activity, therefore growth, and therefore when it comes to reinstating the winter fuel allowance and when it comes to removing the 2-child benefit cap, altogether costs about £5 billion. It's chump change. Costs nothing. And obviously you need a whole load of supply side reforms on top of that, which obviously Thatcher brought in as well. And frankly, again, going through other parts of the contract, that is what Reform are all after. These, by the way, are right-wing policies. Raising the income tax threshold, it's been stuck at 12,000 or whatever it is at the moment for about 10 years or something stupid. It's not 10 years, it's 5, but it's still ridiculous it's stuck at that level, especially since we've had hyperinflation since then. The tax threshold is effectively at the point where if you're in full-time work, even on minimum wage, you will be paying income tax, which is quite ridiculous because ultimately when you're at that stage of your career, you're not supposed to be really paying tax, because obviously it's incredibly important to save your money to save for a deposit, buy a house and what have you, save for a family. So Reform are upping that by £7,500 to £20,000 per year, and the higher rate should start at £70,000 because at the moment it's £50,000 and people still seem to think that that's high pay. This will help obviously economic activity. Well, you'll end up with more VAT anyway because people will end up spending more with the more money they have. It'll be quite a big cost, but also what that should do is lower the effect of the NICs that employers have to pay on their workers, given that that's a massive reason that people are getting fired these days. There's also cuts to energy taxes, which is obviously increasing the cost of an awful lot of energy prices, despite what Ed Miliband says. Stamp duty's going down, that won't affect too much. Still a right-wing promise. No VAT tourist tax, that's supposed to increase tourism to the UK, and it's standard for other countries to do. And obviously increasing the threshold for inheritance tax. Again, all particularly right-wing economic policy. When they go left-wing, it's when it's very cheap. When they go right-wing, it's quite expensive. And this was a complaint that an awful lot of people had about Reform. How are you expecting to pay for all this when you're lowering taxes? Well, the answer, of course, was, well, we're going to save it via cutting useless benefit, encouraging people to get back into work, which will wean them off benefits. That will obviously make a lot of economic sense. Again, quite right-wing. Cut everything to do with net zero as well, which I think they estimated cost about £50 billion. You know, packaging it all together, it's more economic centrism than it is left-wing. Again, if we're talking about making tax cuts and making spending cuts that are in the tens of billions of pounds, and then you have the odd, oh, let's give some left-wing economic arguments out here. Okay, winter fuel payments cost about £1.5 billion, 2-child benefit cap being scrapped cost about £3 billion, something like that. As I say, it's chump change, really. Not even things I necessarily agree with, by the way. 2-child benefit cap, again, along with their other policy that they're promising, probably not the worst thing in the world. Winter fuel allowance, as far as I'm concerned, Labour just did the right thing, to be honest with you. But obviously Reform are in a position where they are trying to win votes, and that's why they've ended up in a position where on 2 small-scale policies that have made a lot of noise, though, that's why he's using those 2 to outflank Labour on the left. Frankly, because it's cheap. However, on the much bigger policy, still quite firmly to the right. So, again, I don't agree with the assessment they're a left-wing party. However, they are clearly triangulating on certain policies that are quite cheap. Anyway, there's a few funny tidbits about this whole story. So, when it comes to the two-child benefit cap, the pressure appears to be irresistible. Having backed down on winter fuel payments last week, the Prime Minister is now poised to back down once again, this time over the two-child benefit cap. Yeah, this is the funny thing. Reform has such power that they are forcing Labour to do some of these U-turns, but these U-turns aren't even popular. So the U-turn on the two-child benefit cap may take some time. It's not in that they were going to scrap it and then they didn't. And so they're U-turning and now looking to scrap it. It is not expected to be formally confirmed until the budget, but it is coming. The Prime Minister is said to privately favour the move despite the reservations of some senior aides. The broader issue for Starmer is whether he gets any credit for it. Labour strategists are already questioning the wisdom of backing down over winter fuel payments. The announcement was made with such haste that there is still no clarity over whether it will happen in time for the winter and how many people will be given the payments. The funny thing is, we've just had a winter and there wasn't some mass news story or headlines about hundreds of thousands of pensioners dying due to not being able to afford to heat their home. Oh well, it's politics and it's all based on narratives, I suppose. Why give ground on one of Labour's flagship policies when the economic and fiscal circumstances are worse than they were? The answer lies partly in attempting to manage the party. The PM has been lobbied hard by cabinet ministers and backbenchers alike, and they're on incredibly shoddy ground with one of the largest landslides you could hope for in a parliament, while not having a voter base that really coincides with that popularity. Again, it was one of the lowest turnouts of the century for this election. And this was a cut that has been fairly unpopular, with about 57% of voters not being in favour of changing it to a means-tested winter fuel payment, and 34% in favour of it. I'm very much in the 34% category there, by the way. Whether Starmer gets any credit from voters for reinstating it remains to be seen. Lord Willett, former Tory minister who is president of the Resolution Foundation, said that by contrast, retaining the two-child cap on benefits is popular, even though scrapping it would be far more effective in reducing poverty, which is an argument I hear about quite a bit. In my ideal world, it'd be a voucher system and wouldn't just be direct cash-in-hand benefits, but we don't live in my ideal world, so I'll take what I can get. I do not mind a bit of a safety net, and I do, honestly, when it comes to having families, I don't mind a little bit of support from the government. I don't actually mind my tax money going towards something like that. Obviously, as I say, I'd rather it be a voucher system where the money can't be wasted and that money has to be spent on the child in some way. And in fact, according to Lord Willett, it's absolutely the case that the two-child cap is driving an increase in child poverty. Now, what type of poverty that exactly is, I don't think it's absolute. However, giving kids an easier time as possible is probably a good thing, and a good way to do that is empower the parents, obviously, and some may need help. Whereas if you look at another option, the winter fuel list, pensioners are half as likely to be in poverty as children, and in reality, spreading the winter fuel payment right up to the income scale for pensioners does very little for poverty. And yes, if pensioners can't afford to heat their home, there's always the option to downsize. Typically, pensioners are living in houses that are relatively large, some of them I should say, and are typically either living as a couple or living alone. Ironically, it's the type of thing that would probably help the housing market, but, well, that's another conversation. But you get the idea. Winter fuel payments, people are rather in favour of keeping them the way they were before Labour got in. Child benefit cap's a really weird one. Just take a look at this YouGov polling. Your right-wing parties, Tory and Reform voters, they're very much in favour of keeping the two-child benefit cap, and the whole idea of that is effectively to stop people abusing the system, you know, having more babies just to get more money. And I do understand the logic of it, and I know plenty of nurses who have been on midwife wards telling me that there are people just open about having babies to get the benefit money. There's no doubt about that. But even Labour and Lib Dem voters, known to be more left-wing, even at least half of them are not in favour of releasing the cap. So it's quite strange that Reform are going after this 38% of Labour voters. Though having said that, you start looking at the age groups and, well, it seems to make more sense. They're trying to get the younger people involved in this sort of thing to get the vote of the lowest voting age group in Britain, because 18 to 24-year-olds barely vote, but letting them know if you'll keep their grandparents warm and that they'll be able to afford kids, yeah, that's probably actually going to help them to some degree. And again, I can't see the two-child benefit cap being lifted as a reason that any ex-Tory or Reform voter wouldn't vote Reform. Because again, you look at the whole context, including the rest of their contract and things like that, the implication of some welfare chauvinism as well. It's a mixture of policy that at the end of the day people effectively have the outlook that Reform are going to, yes, get rid of the child benefit cap, but they're only going to give it to British nationals rather than anyone who's had indefinite leave to remain, which I wouldn't be shocked if they have policy on that in the future either. But this stuff's drip-fed, and you end up learning more about it all the closer you are to elections, so, just trust the plan. Again, just to be properly blatant with you, this is just cheap populism. That's what this is. And I'm not shocked it's happening with a populist party, but frankly, as long as Richard Tice is still involved, I'm effectively trusting that they'll end up being pretty Thatcherite. The overall ethos of the party definitely seems to be, let the private sector be as free as it can be, massively reduce government waste and reduce government spending, but then increase it in places where people actually want it increased. This is the point of populism. Do what the people want. Well, the people are largely, obviously there's cohorts, but largely they are economically left-wing, annoyingly. But as I say, I'm not expecting to have these philosophical arguments about free markets and socialism put forward for another few years. People just want a country that works, and it doesn't at the moment. So, it's a bit of cope and seethe. I'm totally fine with admitting that. Reform were never going to be perfect. But given so far their massive spending plans have been, effectively a grand total of 5 million post-election, 5 billion, sorry, yeah, I'm not too worried. And again, the perspective on all this is effectively to attack the Red Wall, which is exactly what got Boris Johnson his victory, because nearly half of all Red Wall voters disapprove of the way Starmer's government has dealt with the benefits-related policy, as ministers face continued pressure over the winter fuel, disability payments and two-child benefit cap. It is funny, Reform didn't actually touch the kind of largest saving, which is the disability payments. Not touch them at all, and that's because, again, they're going for this cheap populism, which I'm totally fine with. According to the survey across 42 traditionally held Labour seats won by the Tories in 2019, 48% of all voters had a somewhat or strongly negative view of the government's handling of the policies, against 25% who approved. They will absolutely be public sector workers, I guarantee it. Even with people who said they voted Labour in last year's election, opinion was evenly split, with a 38% rating for both approval and disapproval in the poll carried out by Merlin Strategy. And obviously the over 65s really hated the cut to winter fuel payments. And the poll overall was just terrible reading for Downing Street, with Red Wall voters also taking a negative view of the government's record so far on the economy, health, taxation, immigration, housing and the environment, defence, crime and foreign affairs. Basically everything. And this is exactly the type of person that Reform are largely trying to get at the moment, because I would imagine they are the most sceptical of Reform. Even though quite a few of them would be fairly pro-Brexit, they obviously see Reform as some sort of Thatcherite 2.0 party, so they're just trying to throw red meat out to these people, but they're doing it in a cheap way. Again, if the disability payments were put in here as well, I'd probably take a different view, but they're doing the cheap stuff, all while still being largely pro-business. So again, it's not perfect, but it'll do. Anyway, just to really throw this point home, in an article called Why People Vote Reform for Electoral Calculus, the number one reason, the economy. The economy remains the dominant concern for the British public, though to be fair that's recently been overtaken by immigration, which basically everyone agrees Reform are the party for fixing immigration, with around half of people identifying it as one of the most important issues facing this country. Again, it's only a single point below immigration now, so it's still very, very much at the forefront of people's minds. The UK economic growth per head has averaged just 4%, wow, no, not even close, 0.4% annually since 2007. Yeah, this is what I mean by fake growth. Most of that is also fake due to the increase in quantitative easing, which was, of course, put in first by the Blair government and carried on by the Tories, because at the end of the day, they were just delivering what the left wing wants and reaping absolutely no credit for it, because it was destroying the economy, and so the left wing took absolutely no credit for ruining it. The less than 0.5% a year, it's just horrible. Growth should be around 2 to 3% each year, so that this weak figure indicates an economy which is basically stagnant. People aren't getting better off, and they have noticed. Very much true. Taxes have kept going up as well. By the end of John Major's government, taxes made up about 30% of GDP, and that's risen now to about 36% of the whole economy. In other words, taxes have gone up by a fifth, over a fifth even. After years of low economic growth, high tax and inflation, it's understandable that public's confidence in the UK's economy's direction has eroded. The establishment parties, however, seem to have no answer to this most important question. Some analysts blame the prolonged low interest rate policy from the central bankers since 2008. That probably wouldn't have been as much of a problem if we borrowed to create infrastructure rather than borrowed to consume, but there we go. This may have destroyed productivity growth by removing the incentives for productive investment. Other economists note the high tax and increased business regulations are rarely associated with strong economic growth. Guess what? Guess the only party that's directly talking about both of these issues, by the way, and actually had plans in their contract that they are currently improving to deal with it. Guess the only party doing anything about that or even talking about it. Yes, correct. Reform. While the economy establishment seems to be trapped in the post-Thatcherite Blairite consensus, MMT, people are looking for alternatives. That's not to say reform has a detailed and credible economic policy of its own. It doesn't. But it's seen as different from the failed consensus. I'm completely fine with that assessment, by the way. I'm not even going to kid myself into thinking that they have the answers to it quite yet. However, as everyone who says, oh, they need policy, yeah, they do, you're right. Thankfully, they have 4 years to get it together before they're even close to having a general election for government. However, the fact they even know to target these two particular things, quantitative easing, low interest rates, massive business regulations, that's excellent. That's news to my ear. It's also music to my ear, but you get my point. But this is the thing, talking about interest rates and all that, you know, left-wingers really don't care to hear that, especially the voters. They, due to the way voting is, they want short-term, how is this going to benefit me type policy, and, well, two-child benefit cap, well, that'll affect some people, sure. If it's only for British nationals, even better. I would imagine that would be the overall plan. And winter fuel allowance, oh, Granny's not going to freeze to death. Regardless of how true that is, this is all about narrative. And again, these are cheap points to make, and I mean that literally. But not only that, these points brought up by the electoral calculus, they're effectively right-wing issues. So again, the whole, reformer pivoting to the left, I mean, Andrew Neil was correct. I think I cut the part of the clip out, but he's basically said, I don't know why people are surprised that populists are going to the left of Labour in some instances. They'll of course do it if it's cheap, and they'll of course do it if in 4 years' time people forget about it and they don't have to implement it anyway. It's political guerrilla warfare is what it is. And overall, I look at these long-term trends of reform. The thing they are really focusing on is getting rid of net zero, making it a bit more free market, though Tidge obviously wants to ban a load of renewable stuff with battery storage systems. Now, I need to look into it properly. I don't know if they're dangerous enough to say they need a ban, but it's something I'm quite happy to be open-minded about. And of course, they talk about quantitative easing, of course. They're all businessmen, they understand what is effectively strangling the economy of Britain. They're people I effectively trust with their overall trends to stay right-wing and throw out some cheap, populist, economically left-wing policies every now and then. This was well within my expectations. I'm not shocked by it. To call them overall a left-wing party, economically, I think it's pretty ridiculous. They're still centre-right. Anyway, today, after Farage has come back from France after his well-deserved holiday, I'd say, he did a press conference covering the two-child benefit cap and the winter fuel payments, and made quite a few claims in there, which are basically things that I was exactly expecting. He made a lot of pro-family points. He made a point about that there should be a transferable tax allowance for married couples, which obviously will encourage people to get married, and that the child benefit cap, removing it, will allow working people to get the family they want. Because at the end of the day, a big reason there is a cost of living crisis is effectively government action. So I think it's only fair that in the short term, there's government action to encourage people to have the families they were planning for. And obviously, he made it very clear that this would only be for British nationals. And then how would they pay for it? Oh, everything I was mentioning before. Tom Harwood nicely summarises. It's by scrapping net zero, scrapping asylum hotels, scrapping the DEI agenda, so every single obligation by law that we have through, say, the Equality Act, and of course there are savings from quangos that we don't need. Music to my ears, all very good stuff, and you know what? If it turns out that we end up saving more than spending here, that's even better. Will the sums lead up to a world like that? I can't say for sure. What I do know once again is that this is a party largely run by business people, and if there's anyone who can balance a budget, it's business people, especially successful ones. So with that, I think I've made my point. This is absolutely cheap red meat for the more left-wing people in the country, especially those in the Red Wall. It's not like they're throwing this out without thinking how they're going to pay for it, whether the sums add up, that is yet to be seen. And the massive pro-family message that was put out today from his speech, link in the description by the way, I'm absolutely on board with. And he goes into a number of other topics, obviously migration, things like that, stuff that I love to hear. So you know what? I can throw a bit of a red meat out for the left-wingers if it gets them on board. I'm happy with that. At the end of the day, there's coalitions that need to be built to actually win a majority in Parliament, where you can actually steer legislation. Right, with that, it's everything I had for you for today. So, tonight we have Tosh Talks. We're talking about what we should do to celebrate England's 1100th birthday, so do catch that tonight over on the Worcester Club. There'll be more Subnautica on Thursday, so do come along and watch that, and then there is Laughing at the Guardian with some Warming on Saturday, so do come along to that. Videos out as and when I can make them. Right, also, if you like the channel and what I do, please do subscribe, leave a like, and leave a comment. If you would like to support it even further, you can always donate to become a channel member, or donate by super chats and super thanks on any video or stream that I do. I appreciate everyone who is a member, and of course who gives the one-off donations. Thank you all so much, I couldn't do this without you. Right, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.